Welcome to the April edition of the Nutritionist Webinar 2016. I am Marianne Fessenden from Agricultural Modeling and Training Systems, and I serve as your English language host. The purpose of these webinars is to provide access to technical seminars on a range of topics delivered by internationally recognized speakers. The series is a unique three-language presentation held in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Noted ruminant nutritionists will present in English, hosted by AMTS in the United States, while Marcelo Ramos from 3R Labs simultaneously translates into Portuguese for Brazil, and Paula Turillo translates into Spanish for Argentina. Today, the Brazilian webinar is hosted by Marcos Neves. Marcelo is translating for a group of nutritionists. There will be a post-presentation question and answer period during which listeners can submit questions through me, Marcos, and Paula. A complete recording of archived webinars as well as the question and answer session for each will be available on the 3R Lab and AMTS websites. We're very pleased and honored to have James Drackely here today as our April presenter. Dr. Jim Drackely is a professor of animal sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Drackely grew up on a small dairy farm in Minnesota and received his PhD in nutritional physiology from Iowa State University. Since joining the faculty of the University of Illinois in 1989, his research program has focused on nutrition and metabolism of transition cows, fat utilization and metabolism, and aspects of calf nutrition and management. Dr. Drackely has published extensively, including more than 168 articles in refereed journals to date. He has trained 40 graduate students. He has received a number of local and national awards for his research and is consistently on the list of excellent teachers as voted by the students at the University of Illinois. Dr. Drackely was named a Fellow of the American Dairy Science Association, ADSA, in 2015. Dr. Drackely has been active in ADSA, having served as a member of the Board of Directors and Chair of the Production Division, among other roles. Dr. Drackely also has worked extensively with dairy and feed industry groups around the world. Currently, he is a member of the National Research Council Committee to produce the 8th edition of the NRC publication, Nutrient Requirements of Dairy Cattle. So Dr. Drackely, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, Marianne, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And thank you for I'm really happy to be invited to present this webinar today. And we're going to talk about baby calf nutrition. So today I'm going to focus a little bit on some aspects important to calf nutrition that are important for health, growth, and future productivity in dairy animals. You're going to be having a couple of other webinars in this series over the next several months that will deal more with the growing heifer and some aspects of feeding management and housing. It'll be a little bit later in the year. So today I'm going to cover some of the basics from the nutritional standpoint. We'll start out with just a little bit of context here. Heifer raising is a huge investment, huge part of the cost of a dairy enterprise, and I'd like to encourage those of us that work with producers to think of it as an investment and help them think of it as an investment rather than just a cost. So if we look at Iowa State University Extension estimates from a couple of years ago, the cost to raise a heifer was a total of about $2,260 to freshening at 24 months of age. So that's a substantial investment, of course, increased because of the increase in feed prices over the last several years. Under today's price situation, it might not be quite that high, but it's still a large investment for dairy farms. So a breakdown of costs from the same Iowa State group is shown in this slide. Over half of the cost of raising that heifer to calving relates to feed cost, and you can see the other categories there as well. If we pull out costs that would be most specifically associated with the calf rearing period through weaning, you can see about $160 per calf for milk replacer and calf feed, and about $70 per head for vet and medicine fees. So we've got about 10% of the total cost represented during that early calf period. So if we look at it on a per day cost, it certainly is the most expensive time of the growing period. By the Iowa State estimates, the cost was $5 to $6 per day, and that's over double the cost for a post-wean heifer. So certainly producers see that large cost as a challenge to their profitability. If we can improve the growth rate and the time, reduce the time that it takes to grow that animal into a dairy replacement, of course, we reduce the cost of that replacement heifer. For example, using the same assumptions here, if we decrease the age to first calving by 1 month, we'd save almost $100 in the rearing costs of the heifer. So certainly a large challenge here of investment costs, but again, we can't think of it all as just costs. We have to think about it as the cost of the investment, hopefully that will be returned in future productivity. So we'll come back to that point here in a little bit. So because feed represents over half of the cost of rearing heifers and certainly a major part of the early pre-wean and weaning period for calves, we're going to talk today a little bit about why we feed, what we do, and when. Of course, we know that the calf goes through several stages in this early life period, from the colostrum as the first food, through milk replacer or milk as the liquid feed during the pre-ruminant stage, beginning to eat starter dry feeds to help the rumen develop and transition the animal into a functioning ruminant, and then at that time increasing uses of various forages when we do have the ruminant animal. So really an exciting time from the standpoint of the biology of the calf, but these changes and adaptations in the biology also pose some problems for producers and their advisors. Calves, just like any other animal, require several basic nutrients. So water is the most important and also most frequently neglected nutrient, needed in large quantities. We have various nutrients then that provide energy to the animal. We need protein, sources of amino acids, a variety of minerals, from macro minerals to trace or micro minerals, and then also vitamins, which are more important during this pre-ruminant phase because the rumen of the animal is not producing its own B vitamins, for example. So really nothing remarkable there in terms of the types of nutrients that calves need relative to other animals. We have requirement systems that have been defined by various groups. We're currently working with the last edition of the NRC Nutrient Requirements of Dairy Cattle publication. And as Marianne said, the new edition will be out at some point, I believe in my lifetime, still a little ways away. But the NRC has broken those requirements down into maintenance and growth functions for calves. Maintenance will include all the basal functions just to keep the animal alive, heart beating, lungs breathing, and so on. It also includes any increment necessary for regulation of body temperature, for example, in cold climates or in hot climates. And then when we have some sort of an immune or stressor challenge to the animal, those additional nutrient requirements will be lumped into maintenance and, of course, would also take nutrients available from growth. So growth in this period of life, of course, is mostly increase in the frame size or stature and so on, and that's predominantly constituted by the bone and muscle of the growing calf. So protein is a critical nutrient during this time, as it helps form the matrix of the bone and lay down the different muscle systems. Now, one of the problems for the last several decades has been that we don't really have any good goals or standards to look at calf performance. How do we know as a producer or one of our clients that the calf operation is performing as well as it should be? Is it performing up to industry standards? So several years ago, the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association came out with the first gold standards, which are now being revised, but I imagine the same types of messages will still be there. So the standards that the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association set were to decrease mortality to less than 5%, and note that that's mortality or calves alive at 24 hours. So they're cut off for when an animal is stillbirth versus died after the stillbirth period. Second standard relates to morbidity or illness and deals with a number of treatments for diarrhea and respiratory disease, goals less than 25% and 10% respectively. And the third goal then relates to growth performance and will be directly related to some of our concepts in nutrition today. So the idea that was established here was to double the birth weight of the calf by 8 weeks of age, 56 days of age. So for a typical Holstein birth weight, we would have the heifer gaining at an average of 0.73 kilos a day from birth through 56 days of age. One of the interesting things when these standards came out was that there was some criticism that they were not really not very aggressive or progressive, but I think it surprised many people exactly how difficult it was to have that kind of sustained growth rate and reach the doubling of birth weight. I think since that time, we've made quite a bit of progress, certainly in many herds. Now, why this emphasis on early growth rate? And this is an important theme that we'll be revisiting here during the comments today. So a little bit of my soapbox comments here. I think that all of us that are working with the dairy industry are in the food production business. And we can use that analogy of a production industry to think about what we're doing with various aspects of the dairy enterprise. So our production machinery, if you will, is a collection of very highly sophisticated bioreactors. That's our cows. And if we're going to keep replacing those production units, it takes about 24 months to build one of those and put it into service. So that business then is converting human inedible feed into very high quality human foods. In all things we do then as a business, we have to think about the efficiency, which deals with output to input relationships. And we have to have those efficiency indicators as major metrics in evaluating the enterprise. So for example, we use milk per feed as the kind of the gross feed efficiency evaluator for our milking cows. But we haven't typically done that for calves, and I think we need to. We need to think about cost per unit of body weight gain rather than cost per day, or the gain per feed dry matter intake. How can we maximize that so that we end up with the best quality production unit at the end of the day? Thinking of investments or costs, we have to evaluate them on what they do for us in terms of the final endpoint. So some kind of a measure of, are we getting a better heifer for that change in investment cost? I think this is a major challenge yet for many of the people that we work with in the dairy industry. I don't think any other manufacturing business would focus only on the cost per day. Certainly it's an important factor, but it also relates critically, it's interrelated with effects on efficiency and profitability of the enterprise. So moving on then back to some of the biology and nutritional aspects, we need to remember that healthy rapid growth is going to begin at birth, actually in the maternity pen. So aspects of maternity pen management are critical and beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But things like the calving protocols, are workers well trained to recognize the normal birth progress, to identify when cows need assistance, to give appropriate assistance. Assisting the calf after it's born, going through the normal processing tasks such as dipping the navel with iodine, for example. All these are critical parts of getting the calf off to a good start. The second part of that then would be the colostrum program, which we'll just review a little bit in the next couple of slides. So we have to have a good or an excellent colostrum program to have maximal impact on efficient growth during the pre-weaning period. Colostrum is an old story, of course, for those of us that have worked with the industry, but it doesn't mean it's any less important today than it was many years ago. And we still struggle with colostrum management on too many farms, I believe. As nature's first food, there are a lot of functions for colostrum, clearly shown to be the single most important management factor for improving chances of calf health and survival. For example, the NAM study back in the late 1990s estimated that 31% of all heifer deaths could be prevented just by improving colostrum management. We know the immune factors and a transfer of antibodies to the young calf. Sometimes forget about the nutritional importance of colostrum, a very rich source of many nutrients, the majority of those nutrients being much more concentrated within colostrum than they are in mature milk. And again, a strategy for the mother to transfer some of these vital nutrients that may be stored in the calf for some period of time to get that calf off to a good start until it can establish its own source of external nutrition. Lots of aspects that have been emphasized in colostrum management, and we'll just use the commonly identified ones of as quickly as possible, getting an adequate quantity into the calf, looking at colostrum quality in terms of its antibody content, and certainly a very important aspect that's really been emphasized in the last decade or so, sanitation and cleanliness. The appreciation for how quickly colostrum can become contaminated with bacteria, other pathogens, at every step of the way from collection from the cow through to delivering it to the calf. So very important aspect that's been given more attention in recent years. Again, we're dealing with a race against time here to get those colostral antibodies into the calf's digestive system before the environmental bacteria and other pathogens. Colostrum is a lot more than just the antibodies and the nutrition, though. In recent years, we've also came to an understanding of the richness of colostrum in terms of other factors that may influence the growth and long-term productivity of the calf. Specifically here, there are a host of non-nutritive or non-antibody substances found in colostrum that may deliver what's called the lactocrine effect or lactocrine effects to the young calf. Again, these are materials that are passed from the mother to the calf within the colostrum, again, in many cases in much more concentrated fashion than we have in mature milk. So a variety of substances here that are of interest, various peptide and steroid hormones, various growth factors, cytokines, and other factors involved with the immune system, recently identified microRNAs. Probably more and more will continue to be identified, and the possible functions to the calf will become appreciated. But at this point, we know that we have to have adequate or excellent colostrum management to take advantage of improved nutrition early in life. I'm going to just use this slide, which is some of our data from a few years ago. Mike VanAmburgh's group at Cornell has a nice, more recent study that's coming out with these same ideas. In this study, we use purchased male calves that we shipped in, and we're comparing either a conventional limited rate of milk replacer or an intensified or accelerated type of milk replacer feeding program. We looked at growth then of those calves over the first 5 weeks, and after the experiment, retrospectively went back and compared that in calves that had adequate or inadequate or poor colostrum status. And we assessed those or grouped the calves based on the blood IgG concentration at 2 days of age. And so you can see the cutoff that we used, the number of calves that fell into each of these groups. As you can see, about half or so of the bull calves we purchased had not had adequate colostrum, which is not surprising, unfortunately, and the average IgG content for each of the two groups. So the colostrum status in the control or low milk replacer fed groups didn't seem to matter in terms of the growth rate over the first 5 weeks. But for the intensified group, there was a significant difference with about 100 grams more of average daily gain for calves that had adequate colostrum status versus inadequate. This was independent of apparent health events in the calves, and so we believe that it's related to the provision in the colostrum of an adequate amount and profile of these non-nutritive or lactocrine type substances that help to turn on the various systems of the calf, start the intestinal tract function and development, turn on the muscle to allow it to grow, and so on. So a very exciting area that's getting a lot of attention by many groups around the world. So moving on then from colostrum into the other aspects of nutrition, and just a reminder about water. As I said earlier, probably the most neglected and often inadequate or unsuitable component of the whole nutritional scheme. The picture just shows a nice calf stall that I saw in China several years ago. The nice stainless steel bowl there, but unfortunately it's completely dry, which doesn't do the calf much good if there's no water in it. Calves need free water even though they're being fed milk or milk replacer. The milk replacer or milk is going to bypass the rumen by the reticular groove closure, whether it's fed by nipple or bucket. So the calves need supplemental water to get into the developing rumen and support the establishment of the microbial environment. And the relationships are about 1 kilogram of starter intake to 4 liters of water. It's very important. If we're limiting water intake, we're probably going to be limiting starter intake and certainly limiting overall growth potential. So as we move then into the milk feeding stage, a number of options, of course, for feeding the calf. But we need to remember here that as a young mammal, calves are born with the digestive machinery to use only milk as their source of nutrients. They're not designed to be consuming calf starter or forage in the first few days of life, and even most non-milk ingredients used in milk replacers. So the ability to use these other non-milk ingredients is going to develop fairly rapidly over the first 3 weeks of age or so. The ability to use forage, however, will take several weeks until the rumen is fully established and we can get the cellulose digesting, fiber digesting population and environment established in the young calf. I always like to look at the natural situation, so Mother Nature's feeding program. I think not to say that we need to return to that type of management, but I think it helps describe the boundaries of the system that we're working with and maybe offer some areas to work with instead of against. So cow's milk, as we know, is about 25 to 26% protein on a dry solids basis. The feeding rate is at least twice of what we've come to think of as conventional feeding rate. So a kilo to a kilo and a half or more solids per day versus a half kilo of milk solids offered. That's going to be spread over several meals. It may range from 6 to 12 meals over the course of the day if the calf has ad libitum access to milk or to its mother. The first solid feed that the calf probably consumed from an evolutionary standpoint would have been early spring grass, very lush quality grass, high in sugars, fructans, very non-lignified plant cell walls, and so probably a great feed for delivering a higher butyrate fermentation. You know, butyrate is key to developing the rumen papillae or the rumen epithelium. Weaning under the natural system, or if we think of beef cattle, would be much later in life than we typically do with dairy calves, and a much more gradual process than we often make the weaning process in dairy calves. So again, a very different set of paradigms here from what we have come to think of how calves are raised. So what happens then if you leave a modern Holstein calf with a cow? This was a very interesting experiment about 10 or 15 years ago now at the University of British Columbia. in which they did leave Holstein calves with their mother and compared that with a group of calves that were fed 10% of body weight as milk from a bucket. So if you look at the right-hand figure here, the calves that were separated at day 1 and fed a limited amount of milk, you can see the small amount of weight gain over the first 14 days. But the calves that were left to suckle their mothers had a huge weight gain during that time period. And if we look at the average daily gain, it was about 3 times faster for the calves that were fed with that were left with the mother compared with the limit-fed group. And I think the rate of gain over 1 kilo a day in the first 2 weeks of age it certainly surprised me when I first started to think about these things many years ago. I don't think a lot of people would appreciate or predict that a dairy calf could grow that rapidly in the first 2 weeks of life. But that's the machinery, that's the potential of the calf that we have not taken advantage of. So the question that we and others have been asking over the last 10 to 15 years is, are we feeding enough milk for growth and health? Certainly we know clearly that the more milk we feed, the faster the calves will grow during that period. I think somewhat tongue-in-cheek that the best innovation in calf nutrition, calf feeding over the last several years has been introduction of 3/4, 3-liter, and 4-liter nursing bottles. Too often we have dictated nutrition of calves by the bottle size or a milk replacer scoop size or milk replacer bag weight rather than having anything to do with the calf's biology itself. So I think this has helped in a lot of cases increase the amount of milk or milk replacer fed during early life. Now, as I said, the NRC has established requirements for the young calf and the calf through the weaning transition. Mike VanAmburgh and I worked based on some of our recent body composition experiments to tweak those requirements, to modify the equations from the NRC to more accurately predict what we see in the calves being fed more as dairy replacements rather than as veal calves, which a lot of the earlier data was based on. And so these modified equations have been adopted by AMTS in their calf prediction section and do a much better job of predicting the effects of higher feeding rates and higher rates of gain. If we want calves to grow more rapidly during the milk feeding period, then we need to feed them more milk solids. That shouldn't be much of a surprise. As that increased intake of milk solids occurs, we're going to be providing more energy, providing more protein, and because of the relationships between protein and energy, the protein content of the diet has to increase progressively as we go to high growth rates. And so a couple of take-homes from that slide, I hope. First of all is, if we're thinking back to conventional rates of body gain, where we might be gaining 200 grams to 300 grams per day, we probably would be fine with an 18 to 20% protein milk replacer fed at the rates that we've been feeding it. However, if we want calves to grow anywhere close to their potential, we have to feed much more milk early in life, and that milk or milk replacer has to contain a higher amount of protein than what we think of as a standard 20/20 milk replacer. So again, the energy and protein supplies must be in the correct proportion to each other for the desired rate of gain. The energy intake will be primarily determined by the amount of milk or milk replacer that we're feeding. For example, it doesn't affect it too much whether we're thinking about a 15% fat or a 20% fat milk replacer. The biggest effect is going to be how much of that liquid feed are we providing per day. The protein intake by the calf, though, will be affected both by the amount fed, but also variations in the protein content of the milk replacer. And so, again, it's important to select the appropriate milk replacer for the given desired performance rate. This is an example from some Carrie Bartlett's work several years ago of the effect of increasing milk replacer amounts fed. And you can see the linear increase in average daily gain here as the calves were fed more of the same milk replacer. And importantly, we found no effect on the composition of that body weight gain. So we're not creating fat animals when we have a sufficient amount of protein provided in the increased amounts of the liquid feed daily. If you'll note inside the bars, the black numbers there are the gain to feed ratio. And so we're becoming more efficient also in a linear fashion as we're feeding more milk during early life. The same idea as the dilution of maintenance concept. So there's more performance relative to the overhead costs of maintaining the animal. Protein is critically important in the early life period. This is, again, data from one of our experiments where we compared two feeding rates and also different protein contents in the milk replacers. And you can see if we look at the body protein gain, whole body protein gain, compared with protein intake, it's a very tight linear relationship. So protein is very important for laying down that frame, as we mentioned earlier, and very critical to the rate of overall body protein. So why do we so often fight Mother Nature instead of working with her? That's, again, back on my soapbox a bit. But this is another aspect where we've deviated from the calf's biology so much that perhaps we've lost sight of what's normal and what's not. So many years ago, it was a management decision to try to limit milk or milk replacer intake to the typical rates of 8 to 10% of body weight. There were a number of reasons to do that, but the most commonly cited reason was to try to promote early intake of starter and then allow earlier weaning, of course, decreasing labor needs as well as the unit cost of the feeds being provided. One of the consequences of that strategy is that starter dry feed will provide only a minor contribution to the total nutrient intake until at least the second week of life or so. And growth then becomes very proportional to the rate of starter intake in that type of system. This is a summary figure from the Purina research program from many years ago that Al Kurtz and colleagues provided. And it shows the influence of a very aggressive early weaning program. So the calves were only fed 450 grams or a pound per day of milk replacer powder for the first 3 weeks of age. They dropped one feeding then, so only a half a pound or 225 grams of powder during the fourth week, and they were weaned then at the end of 4 weeks. So the figure shows a couple of relationships here. The blue curve is starter intake by week, and the red curve is the average daily gain. So you can see in the first 2 weeks of life, the rate of gain is very low, about what we predict from like the slide I showed earlier with low rates of milk replacer intake, about 250 grams per day. As starter intake increases and essentially doubles each week, then the calves have enough nutrients to start growing more rapidly. So you can see a big increase here by the third week of life. But then when they removed one feeding, the growth rate stopped increasing at such a rapid rate. The calves were not yet able to fully replace the milk with starter intake. So the point again is that the rate of growth becomes very proportional to how the calves are eating starter in such a system. Now we know that calves that are fed higher rates of milk or milk replacer will grow much more rapidly, as we've already mentioned. And the main difference here is going to be within the first 3 weeks of life or so, when we take advantage of that rapid the potential for rapid growth rate. After that, then the growth curves might be a little bit more parallel. But really thinking about what's happening in the first 3 weeks of life if we're limiting the intake of milk during that period and calves are not growing anywhere close to their potential. If we're doing this correctly with milk or an appropriate milk replacer, we're increasing frame size. This is withers height of the calves, and you can see the continuing divergence of the withers height in the calves fed at a greater rate of milk replacer feeding than the conventional or control calves. Again, we're not depositing excess fat, just the amount of fat that we might want with normal growth, and to provide some measure of reserves to the calf. So an important part of this this argument, of course, is the so what issue. Why would we want to spend more money during early life? So the outcomes or the beneficial impacts of better early nutrition are certainly important, and we'll show some examples here of where we see benefits. So here's some of the most important, I think. First of all, capitalizing on that rapid early growth potential that we've ignored for many years. Certainly the most efficient time for relative weight and height increases in the entire rearing period. If we're doing that, we should be able to decrease the days to breeding size, and by extension then days to first calving. Increasing evidence that we are able to improve health, the ability of calves to withstand the challenge, and probably the most exciting is the growing appreciation that we are having positive effects on future productivity. This is another summary from Al Kurtz and his colleagues that looked at heifer growth over the period from birth to first calving. And what's shown here in the open bars is the percentage body weight increase relative to the previous 2-month period. We could do the same thing for withers height, but this shows the percentage change in body weight. So you can see that the calves are the most efficient in terms of relative change in this very early period of life, basically decreasing from birth down to the time that the animal is going to enter the milking string. So that's a time it seems that we should be taking advantage of that ability for efficient growth. The black bars show the feed cost per kilo of body weight gain under these economic conditions. But again, the point being the cost per kilo of gain are the lowest early in life when the animal is depositing a lot of protein and body frame, and become increasingly higher then as it nears its mature size towards freshening. This is one slide just to point out one of the studies that's shown recently that calves fed more milk early in life are better able to withstand an infectious challenge. This was a study at Cornell that looked at a challenge with cryptosporidium. Calves were challenged on day 3 of age, and the comparison here shows how the animals responded if they were on a low rate of milk replacer feeding, 450 grams per day, or a high rate of milk replacer feeding, over a kilo of solids per day. And you can see that during that time of challenge, the calves that were fed conventionally actually lost a little bit of weight, where the calves fed on the high plane of nutrition continued growing through that crypto challenge, and were able to resolve the infection more quickly. So again, more reserves, more ability of the calf to divert the nutrients needed to run an immune system, certainly a benefit of having a better nutritional status early in life. And finally, the production effects. So there's lots of different data sets that have appeared where milk yield was reported as a function of what happened to the pre-weaning feeding program. However, most of those studies in themselves were too small in terms of numbers of animals to detect production differences. We just can't conduct controlled experiments large enough to establish the numbers needed. But if we look at the catalog of these studies that are available, and I think this is a reasonably up-to-date list, you can see that the responses within study, although perhaps not significant within study, all are generally positive, with a couple of exceptions, but certainly a pattern of studies there that would indicate that there's something going on. And indeed, when the Cornell group used some meta-analysis techniques to pool many of those studies together, there was a significant effect of improved early nutrition on first lactation milk yield. And you can see the relationship is about 435 kilograms of first lactation milk for an improvement in of at least 75% in early milk intake. So exciting. This is remains somewhat of a controversial topic as to what the effect is and why it happens or doesn't happen in many studies, and also the biology of what's happening here. Still an area of active investigation, but very exciting in terms of the impact of improved early nutrition on subsequent productivity. So how do we increase milk solids intake? There's actually a number of studies that could be employed. We could simply increase the amount of liquid feed that is fed, so going from 2 liters of feeding to 3 liters per feeding. We can increase the number of feedings daily. Surprisingly, a lot of producers have been moving to a 3 feeding system here in the U.S. in the last several months or a couple of years. Increasing the solids concentration, we can do that to a point. I think the practical limit is probably about 18% solids, even with excellent water management. There's some risk of going beyond that, particularly if water management isn't excellent on farms. There's a number of products or fortifiers available or strategies to increase milk solids using pasteurized milk. That may be quite useful, and certainly the increased interest in automated calf feeders is a wonderful strategy to be able to tailor milk increases and milk decreases around weaning to increase milk intake. A lot of excitement there for the potential to capitalize on some of this biology. Just a note about whole milk. I certainly am a passionate believer that if we're feeding whole milk, particularly waste milk, to calves, that we have to be pasteurizing. Again, the most vulnerable animals on the farm, benefits are proven clearly in terms of health and growth, and I think it's just something that we as an industry have to take a pretty hard stand on. Milk replacers certainly have many advantages. Maybe the easiest way to ensure biosecurity without the cost and labor of a pasteurizer, particularly for smaller operations. Generally a good degree of quality control and consistency if we're dealing with reputable manufacturers. And again, smaller farms perhaps more convenient than going to the additional operation of a pasteurizer. The feeding aspects of milk replacer are very important, or mixing milk replacer with waste milk, for example. Correct and consistent volume for the feeding program goals, not varying those or having a lot of variation from day to day. Mixing so that the concentration is at the desired rate, and that's also consistent day to day. And temperature, adequate hot enough temperature at mixing, a temperature near the calf's body temperature at delivery to the calf, again maintaining those constant from day to day, and then of course the quality and nutritional balance of the milk replacer that we're feeding. So achieving successful results, enhancing early growth is not necessarily an easy process. Like most other good programs on the dairy farm, it does require management. And so several aspects that are important for early growth are shown here. We've already talked about the colostrum program and the importance of supplemental water. We've talked about appropriate milk replacers and the importance of their mixing and delivery. And we'll talk now a little bit more about the starter and weaning management and how that moves on into post-weaning nutrition for the calf. Weaning transition is certainly another transition period that we need to think about for the young calf. Another very critical stage of the calf's life where it's subject to many stressors. We have obvious changes in diet as we remove the liquid feed. A calf has to live entirely on the solid feeds or the starter. We may have a change in location or environment. This might be the first time the calves have to live socially with other calves, and so there's many adjustments that can lead to growth slumps, behavioral stresses, and a greater incidence of disease. So there's a number of challenges in this time that also may be more important with greater rates of milk feeding, or that cause some additional management considerations. One thing that we know very clearly that happens, and probably shouldn't be surprised by it, is that if we increase milk or milk replacer intake early in life, there's going to be a decrease in starter intake, or it will delay the intake by a week or two relative to calves fed less milk. So this is fairly simple to appreciate, I think, if we just remember that like in a mature ruminant, there is a certain maximum dry matter that the calf will consume. With young calves, that's probably, under most circumstances, it's in the range of 2 to 2.5% of their body weight as total solids, whether that's milk solids or starter. So it's natural then, if we have very high rates of milk early in life, that they will not be able to have the same increases in starter at that time. So an example, just comparing the results, this is an experiment from Kate Coles that showed that calves fed a conventional limited milk program had much greater early increases in starter intake up through weaning. The calves that were fed an intensified program were somewhat delayed in their starter intake. Once we begin to decrease the amount of milk fed, the rates of starter intake will begin to increase very rapidly, just as in the conventionally fed calf. But certainly the effect is there, and we need to understand how to manage that. Starter concentrates are, of course, critical for rumen development and being able to turn that animal over into a functioning ruminant. We can summarize the effects of the diet on rumen development with a few points here. Milk and hay or forage do very little at the early age to develop rumen epithelium or the rumen papillae because the hay or forage in this case is very poorly fermentable, and milk shouldn't be going into the rumen to be fermented there. So the grain starter, or in the case of the grazing animal, perhaps fresh grass, particularly the sugars there, are the key to leading to development of rumen papillae through stimulating VFA production. The papillae development, epithelial development, can occur by 3 to 4 weeks of age with good starter management, and the process takes about 3 weeks from start to finish, no matter when it's initiated in the animal. So if we begin shortly after birth, or if we hold the animal off milk for many months, the process of epithelial development will take about 3 weeks. Many of you have probably seen these pictures or pictures similar. This is a series from Penn State workers. This shows the rumen and reticulum lining of a 6-week-old calf that was fed only milk, no solid feeds. So we can see the rumen on the right with no appreciable papillae development. We can see the buds or the areas where those papillae will develop, but a very smooth surface, and the reticulum also not as developed, and both a very pale light color. So this is an undeveloped rumen epithelium. In contrast, this is the same age calf, 6-week-old calf, that was fed both milk and a starter grain, and you can see the extensive development of the rumen papillae on the lining of the rumen, and the much deeper folds here associated with the reticulum or honeycomb. And also the darker color that's very characteristic of the maturation of the rumen epithelium. If we compare a 6-week-old calf that was fed only milk and dry hay, it doesn't look much different than the calf that was fed milk only. No appreciable papillae development or reticular development, and very pale color. Again, the poor fermentability of hay as a source of nutrition for the developing microorganisms. Now, one of the problems that was inherent in much of the early research and also in the field is that calves will stall out in terms of growth around weaning if we're dealing with increased milk feeding rates. So an example here actually from one of our own studies, this is average daily gain per day, so this is not total body weight. But during the milk feeding period when the calves were receiving more milk, they were growing much more rapidly than the conventional calves. But then when we started decreasing the milk intake, the rates of average daily gain slumped during this couple of week period around weaning until they resumed then after the animals were completely weaned. Again, lots of data would show this, lots of field experience. Reasons for this probably relate to the rumen not being developed adequately to make the transition at that time of the calf's life or as abruptly as it's being made. These are data from Alex Bach's group in Spain, and also there's work from the AKI group here in the US that have shown decreased digestibility of primarily of starter the week after weaning in calves that were fed greater rates of milk before weaning. So you can see that the calves that were fed intensively or accelerated program had lower digestibilities of dry matter, organic matter, protein, energy, and particularly for NDF or fiber. And this is an indicator that the rumen microbial population and the epithelial structure perhaps have not reached the same level of maturation as the control or conventionally fed calves. We do know, though, that with proper nutritional management during and after weaning, we can prevent most of that weaning slump, and calves will continue to grow rapidly and in many cases continue to diverge from the conventionally fed animals. Again, from one of our studies a few years ago, the calves that were fed a greater amount of milk were heavier from a very early point in age. We maintained that difference through weaning and actually continued to diverge slightly by 20 weeks of age and maintained the difference even by 35 weeks of age. So we know that we can manage that time around weaning to prevent the drastic weaning slump. One of the side things to remember here, not related to nutrition, but again, being the transition period here, we don't want to pile a lot of other stressors onto the calves at the same time as we're changing the nutrition. So not moving or regrouping calves for a week or so after weaning, not abruptly changing the starter to a grower in the first group, and not doing any other management or medical treatments at the same time. We'll try to minimize the number of stressors that the calves have to deal with during this weaning transition. In terms of meeting the nutrient requirements of calves around weaning, then, we're going to look at factors related to starter providing the nutrients. Starter will provide less energy per unit of solids than milk solids, primarily because of the lower digestibility, slightly lower gross energy content. So the efficiency of use of the metabolizable energy products from VFA and other digestion products is not greatly different, but it's really the digestibility that we have to consider. So according to the NRC, the last NRC calculation, starter was only about 65 to 70% of the ME compared with milk replacer. And as a result, growth will only be about 2/3 of that on an equal amount of dry matter from starter as what we would see on milk replacer. So we can illustrate this by using the NRC to propose a couple of scenarios here, where we have two different body weights of calves at weaning, either 60 or 80 kilograms, and then two different rates of average daily gain that we want the calves to continue to grow at, 600 or 800 grams per day. So you can see that even at the low growth rate with the smallest calf, the NRC says the calf would need 1.5 kilos of starter to support that rate of growth, and up to over 2 kilos of starter per day at the larger calf growing more rapidly. Now, there's been some concern that the NRC is underestimating the value of starter, and I think there's some things that maybe need to be changed there. But the point is still that the starter will not be able to replace pound for pound or kilo per kilo milk solids in terms of supporting growth. So just because of the differences in the energy content and how it's used by calves, we need somewhere in the 1.8 to 1.6 to 1.8 times more starter than milk replacer to support the same amount of body weight gain. So perhaps it's not surprising that many calves do slump in growth for a few days around the time of weaning. So starter formulation is a whole other topic, and many successful commercial starters, many individually formulated starters that can support good growth in calves. But some of the general characteristics here that need to be evaluated would be palatability, first and foremost. If the calves won't eat the starter or eat it more poorly than other formulations, then we're certainly not going to achieve the results we need. Sufficient fiber, so we have to have NDF fiber to be fermented to support rumen health, adequate particle size, general minimums 15% NDF, although with more use of soluble fibers and so on, other types of fiber, we may actually see many starters that are higher than that in NDF. Easily fermentable carbohydrates. Again, it's going to be the fermentation of principally starch and some of the more easily fermented structural carbohydrates that will support that rumen development. We need to be supplying protein or nitrogen both for the rumen and also for direct digestion post-ruminally by the calf. So typically we would be thinking, according to the NRC, of 18% crude protein starters, but much higher often used for calves that are growing more rapidly earlier in life. Oil seeds or fat sources generally have not improved performance. In fact, in most cases have been slightly negative. So we generally try to minimize fat provision. Corn byproducts, some of them have also seemed to be less palatable than others. And of course, the mineral and vitamin supplementation is still very important as the first solid feed here. Now, I want to show just what the pattern of daily starter intake is as we work through the weaning process. So again, I'll use some of our data here from Jennifer Stamey's work. So this shows, again, daily starter intakes across the weaning transition for calves that were fed a conventional program or a couple of intensified programs that differed in the protein content of the starter. The major point I want to make is what happens when we make a reduction in milk intake. So here we drop to 1 milk feeding per day, and the calves then will quite quickly increase starter intake, regardless of the treatments here. Over the next 3 days or so, the intake will increase, approximately double, and kind of reach a new plateau then for a few days. And when we finally wean completely a week later, you can see the same thing happens. So quite rapid increases over a period of 3 or 4 days in starter intake. So if the calf is able to digest the starter feed, if the rumen is adequately prepared to make that transition, then the increases in intake necessary to support the growth will be quite rapid. One of the problems in this study is that we were initiating weaning here at the same age, regardless of whether the calves were ready or not, and so the starter intake is much lower, and we did have somewhat of a growth slump around the time of weaning. So adequate starter intake for a period before weaning is still very important. This figure looks at the relationship between starter intake in the week before weaning and average daily gain in the weaning week, or week that we are weaning, actually going through the final weaning of calves. So you can see the very strong relationship here between the pre-weaning starter intake and post-weaning or weaning average daily gain. Again, just illustrating the importance of being able to utilize the starter and make that smooth transition. So we can use the relationship there to say, for example, that if we want calves to continue growing at 1 kilo a day, according to these data, they should be eating 1.3 kilos of starter the week before we begin the weaning process. Other factors that have been investigated with calves fed greater amounts of milk include the time or the age of weaning. This is another British Columbia experiment that looked at a conventional low plane of nutrition or high milk feeding, either weaned at the same early age, weaned completely by the 7th week, or that was fed later to 12 to 13 weeks of age. So this top figure shows the milk intake. Starter intake is shown in the bottom. The calves that were fed more milk had lower rates of starter intake compared with the, I may have misspoke, their calves fed the higher amounts of milk had lower starter intake compared with the lower milk intake calves. Again, you can see the same rates of change that we've already discussed. The right-hand panel here shows the weight gain as a percentage of body weight during weaning and then the week after weaning. So the middle bar here, the mean and the variation of the data, is for the calves that were fed the high amount of milk and then weaned at an early age. And you can see during weaning and even after weaning, they're struggling relative to the conventionally fed calves or to the later fed higher milk intake calves. So there is something to be understood here or considered about weaning age if we're going to be relying more on greater milk intakes early in life. Another factor relates to the speed of weaning, and slower weaning or more gradual weaning will improve starter intake and perhaps ease that weaning transition. Again, another British Columbia experiment. These calves were fed with an auto feeder. One group was weaned abruptly, so a high rate of milk intake was stopped just abruptly with no decrease. Another group was weaned over a period of 4 days, gradual reduction of milk over that period. Another group over 10 days, and then the final group began at 22 days. So the starter intakes were greater for the calves that were with the longest weaning period. You can see the abruptly weaned calves here were at a real disadvantage in terms of intake around weaning. The 4-day calves probably also not quite enough time to get the starter intake up there. The 10-day weaning group did the best in terms of maintaining its growth, that the advantage in growth early and still allowing a smooth weaning. So some degree of gradual adjustment certainly is important, particularly with high milk intakes. Now, the last topic I want to address today relates to forage intake and forage offering to calves. This is a topic that's been ongoing discussion, quite controversial, and again, coming back into the discussion again in recent years. And I think there's a lot of very tightly held opinions here that maybe we can find some common ground and come to an understanding about what's really happening here in terms of forage provision. So first, just think about what the calves would do, again, if they had access to forage availability. This is a farm I visited in China. Actually been there a couple of times. This is the first weaning group of calves, about half of this pen. Pretty comfortable facilities, dry, they have sun shade, there's adequate space even though probably too big a group of first calves. If you go into the feeding structure, into the barn, and look down the feed row, this is the way they were feeding the calves in this first group after weaning. They had a starter concentrate put out separately from ad libitum alfalfa hay, and this was a very nice, high-quality alfalfa hay. So it appears that we have calves selecting either one, but if I back away and show you the full picture, most of the calves here are choosing to eat that very nice alfalfa hay compared with the starter. It was really quite surprising to see the calves eat that. Long-stemmed, eating the entire stems, kind of different than some of the picture that many of us have gotten to have about calves and forage. But certainly in this environment, the calves were very eager to eat the hay in preference to the starter. So the arguments that we've had for many years against offering forages relate to that very aspect. If we're limiting intake of the concentrates by offering free choice hay, the calves aren't going to grow well. Hay is not well digested and fermented in the young calf. So we get an accumulation of undigested mass there, a hay belly, and we have less concentrate intake, which is actually going to be able to be fermented and used by the calf for growth. We know that hay is not really necessary for development of the rumen volume, to develop rumination, and it also does not reliably increase the rumen pH, which is usually quite low in the early calf rumen. That's part of the issue with developing fiber digestion. We have to increase the pH to the range where those fiber digesting organisms can thrive and grow. So again, the arguments then would say we don't want to feed hay before weaning. Unless calves are not bedded on any straw, or if we're having bloating occur with a pelleted starter, we shouldn't be feeding hay, according to this logic. And that's a story that we've been providing for many years. Now, here's an example of the impact of that. So here's, again, slides that I got from Jim Quigley, actually, but another Chinese dairy farm that he visited. I saw similar things. Here's a group of calves that are still on milk. They're very sleek, well-fed, nice hair coats, doing very well before weaning, most of them. But then the weaning group went into this situation. So calves that were, again, offered a very poor quality forage, free choice, a limited amount of starter concentrate, and very quickly these nice milk-fed calves had turned into this. So very unthrifty calves, rough hair coats, hay bellies, not growing very well, a lot of respiratory issues. So this is a very common scenario that we see with inappropriate hay feeding and limited concentrate feeding. But there are arguments being made for the provision of forage. And again, it's 2 or 3 groups around the world conducting research in this area that have provided some very interesting data. There's evidence from a behavioral standpoint that calves seem to crave forage fiber, or something that they can chew on, and that may satisfy a number of behavioral needs and prevent stereotypic behaviors. So a small amount of hay actually has been shown to increase starter intake and overall feed efficiency in some of these experiments. It may keep the rumen papillae healthier and prevent abnormal growth. And so this camp has argued that we should be feeding small amounts of hay along with concentrates before weaning. So how do we reconcile these two very different opinions? Here's an example of the benefit of forage, perhaps. This is again, experiments from Alex Bach's group, in which they compared the consumption of a concentrate, starter concentrate, and various forages offered free choice. Both the starter and the forage offered free choice within an experiment. And so they had a number of different forages. The hays were chopped so that the particle size was not a big issue. And then what I'm reporting for you here is the average daily gain, and along with the forage to concentrate ratio of what the calves consumed. So, for example, when calves were fed alfalfa hay, they had a 14 to 86 forage to concentrate ratio consumed, so quite high rates of alfalfa consumption. When they were fed these other lower quality forages, they consumed less. But if you note, the average daily gain of the no forage and the high alfalfa hay is about the same, and some of the other forages here, the low quality forages, were actually higher, significantly higher than the controls. So it seemed then that the provision of small amounts of hay was beneficial for overall use of the diet and for growth. I think the thing that we need to appreciate and bring these back together is just what we're talking about here in terms of intake. So if we have calves with a 1.5 kilo total dry matter intake, so whether that's some remaining milk solids, starter, and forage, But for a 1.5 kilo total dry matter intake, the forage intake in these examples that appear to be beneficial would only be about 75 grams per day, very small amount of barley straw or wheat straw or grass hay, versus 210 grams per day for alfalfa hay. And even that's not all that very much. So I think we can reconcile these quite easily from an understanding standpoint. Calves are offered a good quality hay, alfalfa hay in particular, that they're going to like to consume. They will easily consume more than they perhaps should and limit concentrate intake. The other hays they're not going to eat enough of to really limit their intake of the concentrate, and perhaps the overall effect in the rumen is beneficial. The management and practical aspect of this, though, becomes difficult because unless we're providing a small amount of chopped hay with the starter or top dressed onto starter, it becomes difficult to manage. And more often than not, producers will be putting out what amounts to free choice hay, and so we may have some difficulty here. So I think we're perhaps approaching an understanding of why this occurs. Management is perhaps still problematic. So to summarize that, I think that free choice alfalfa hay does clearly decrease starter intake, which is the most important for rumen development. We can use small amounts of grass hay or straws that may actually increase starter consumption and improve overall efficiency of use in the rumen. Hay is not necessary for development of the volume and rumination. Maybe up to 5% chopped hay could be provided with the starter, particularly if calves are not bedded on straw or prevent bloating, but we still shouldn't be providing free choice hay before at least 4 weeks perhaps after weaning. Not that the calves would necessarily consume too much of the grass hay, but it's wasteful. They're not going to eat it, and so it's increasing feed waste and feed cost. So to come back here to wrap things up, I think the argument that we still hear is this is just an added expense. Feeding more milk is too expensive. I don't see any immediate benefit. Why should I be doing it? I think again we have to be educating about cost versus investment. We have to move beyond cost per day as the metric that we're using for evaluating a calf feeding program. We have to be thinking about cost per pound or per kilo of body weight gain or cost per day of life until we get into the milking herd. We have to be thinking of this as a coordinated system with the heifer program. It's not just the milk-fed and weaning calf in isolation. This is a really good economic analysis and simple economic model that Mike Overton put together a few years ago, presented at the Western Dairy Management Conference. And I'd recommend that to you if you want further information and see what the economic outcome is. Their conclusion in this paper was, according to the quote below there, however, even with what some would consider to be an overly conservative approach to modeling the two programs, there should be no doubt to the economic advantage of the intensive approach to rearing dairy replacement heifers. Again, I refer that to you. It's a great summary, and you see all the assumptions that they built into their analysis. So I'll leave you with these conclusions before we go to the questions. Management for greater early growth should also improve health and decrease mortality. These systems are very closely tied together. Increased milk feeding or milk replacer feeding does improve early growth. If we're doing it properly, we can decrease age at first calving, and the evidence is becoming very strong that we're going to see a better cow, increased milk yield. Proper starter and weaning management can preserve that early growth and continue the growth rate without major lags during the weaning transition. We need good colostrum management, excellent colostrum management, and supplemental water provided. Very limited or no hay as part of these programs. And again, thinking cost per unit of weight or frame increase, and if we're doing things correctly, this type of program will pay dividends. So that, thank you all for your attention. Marianne, I'll turn it back to you now, and we can move into the question period. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, Dr. Drackely. Thank you so much. Calf feeding is very near and dear to me, and I found your talk really interesting. Before we get to the question and answer period, I want to introduce next month's nutritionist topic. We will be hosting Dr. Tom Jenkins from Clemson University in South Carolina. Dr. Jenkins received his PhD from Cornell University, and following a postdoc at The Ohio State University, has worked in dairy cattle nutrition at Clemson for over 30 years. His focus has been in the area of the use of fat in diets and work on rumen lipid metabolism. His talk will be on fatty acids in dairy cattle diets. So please be sure to join us for the next webinar on May 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I want to thank the people who made this possible: Tom Taluki and AMTS, USA and Global, Marcelo Hens-Ramos at 3R Lab in Brazil, and today, Marcos Neves Piera, Paula Turillo in Argentina, our translators in each location, and we have our generous sponsors that help make it possible for us to get great speakers like Dr. Drackely and to help manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Ajinomoto Heartland, for superior nutrition through amino acids. Our silver sponsors are Arm & Hammer Animal Nutrition, Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA, DHA omega-3s, and Prequil with omega-6s. Bronze sponsors are Jeffo, Life Made Easier, Dairy One Forage Laboratory, Dairyland Laboratories, and Quality Liquid Feeds. I will now open up the floor for questions. The English language listeners, please remember that we sometimes have trouble with audio, so if you will type your questions in the question and answer window, I will recognize who presented the question and I will ask the question for you. Paula will ask questions for the Spanish language audience. Marcos will ask questions for the Brazilian. So Dr. Drackely, our first question is from Matt Schocking, and his question is, any comments on sodium requirements for calves and potential negative impact of water softener use in auto feeders?
Yeah, that's a very good question, something that we've been hearing quite a bit about lately. It would appear, if we look at the sodium content of a lot of softened water, that it may be higher than we want to have for the young calf in terms of its impact on the cation anion relationships and so on. And so it's not what we would recommend necessarily for the calves. Couple of options there. One is to not use the softened water, which of course may make the cleaning processes a little more difficult, but some people have gone to a potassium-based softening salt, which will lead to greater potassium in the water, but not sodium. As I understand, that's much. I don't know how much more, but it's more expensive. So that's a consideration also. But I think it is a real concern that we have to be thinking about with softened water.
I think that I said Matt, and it's actually Mark, and he has a follow-up question. Any impact of hay intake on esophageal groove and milk replacer bypass?
To my knowledge, there's no data that would suggest that would interfere more than solid feed intake. Not to my knowledge, or more than starter intake, I mean.
So, Paula, are you ready with a question?
It's about mobility. How do you measure it?
Okay. We ready for the answer now?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay. So the first question, the experience with whole corn feeding programs from weaning through breeding age. I think that I don't have much direct experience. Certainly see the programs in many areas of the country and around the world. I think they can be successful with proper supplementation. The animals are going to chew and ruminate the whole grain particles. And so the people that are using those programs seem to have very good success. Well, let me just answer the morbidity then. was measured as the number or the number of calves that required medical treatments for either diarrhea or for respiratory disease.
Yes. Relative to the total of calves.
Yes, yes, the percentage of calves that required treatment.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Drackely, I have a question from Donna Wirtz. Any comments on once-a-day feeding of fortified milk programs with 250 grams of milk replaced or added to 2.5 liters of whole milk as a stable feeding to weaning?
Yeah, I'm really not a fan of once daily feeding. Again, going back to how the calf would prefer to eat, and the probably the biggest problem in terms of the once a day programs are that decreases the number of times that somebody's actually interacting with the calves and observing them and looking for problems. I think particularly in the early life period, that's insufficient amounts of milk, and I'm not a fan at all of the interest in moving back to once daily feeding.
Okay. There's a question about group feeding of calves, if it's a trend or feeding calves in pairs, by thinking on concentrate intake, feed behavior, and even animal wealth.
So I think the newer work that's come around with group housing and group feeding of calves is very interesting for the reasons that you hinted at there. I think it's a much more natural situation, or calves can express more of the behaviors. There's the competitive effects, which actually may help stimulating overall feed intake and growth rates. So I think from a welfare standpoint, there's certainly growing interest in that type of system. The feeding management is, of course, is a concern. That we have to have an appropriate system where all calves are going to be able to drink enough. The automated feeders are probably the top, the best scenario, but there are people that make other simpler systems of greater milk feeding, not necessarily 24 hours a day, but for limited amounts of the day, also make those systems work. I think from a standpoint of health and well-being, the physical facility is really important. Ventilation of those facilities and the ability to keep clean air and dry bedding is really important. One of the big problems we see with trying to introduce group feeders in old facilities, the retrofitting is often problematic because you just can't design the facility for proper ventilation. So I think those are some of the concerns. But if we have a facility with good ventilation and a good feeding system, the results can be very good. Certainly the all-in, all-out type approach also has advantages for disease control.
Okay. Marcos, do you have follow-up questions?
I will have more. Another one is about the biology of the mammary gland growth. For example, when you have high rates of gain before puberty, how is this story, this old concept?
Yeah. So the idea has been that if we have excessive growth rates that lead to fattening, that we would have fat deposited in the mammary pad, the developing or the undeveloped mammary pad of the heifer, and that this would replace or interfere with secretory tissue as the animal then further developed into a milking animal. A couple of points on that, and some of the, again, Cornell research here from a few years ago is really, I think, very effectively answered this. One issue is that if we have fat being deposited in the mammary pad, we probably have fat being deposited everywhere in the body, and so that we're just developing an overall fatter heifer, and it's not necessarily the fact that it's the direct or specific deposition of fat in the mammary pad. It's just that we're going to have problems with a fatter heifer, which we know generally don't do as well as heifers in proper condition. The other aspect, though, related to looking at the differences in growth rates, and I think that the Cornell group showed very clearly that the rates of DNA deposition, which would indicate the secretory function, are kind of on a constant daily amount per day. And so if we're getting heifers that are growing more rapidly and reaching calving in fewer days, there may be less DNA deposited in the mammary gland, but that's not a function of this fattening and so on that the older research was how it was interpreted. So I think again that if we're feeding appropriately and not getting fat heifers at that stage, then I think the risk of improper development of the mammary gland and leading to low production is an outdated concept.
Hey, Dr. Drackely, I have 3 right off the top that I'm going to ask, and then I know that Paula has some. So the first is from Bill Top, and he says, what is your opinion of feeding extra supplemental essential lipids and butyrate to calves?
Some of the work that's been done over recent years is, I think, is interesting with regard to the essential fatty acids. Certainly, the profile can be different compared with whole milk fat. If we look at the profiles that are usually used in profiles of fats used in milk replacers, so the essential fatty acids, linoleic and linolenic, may have some beneficial effect. The butyrate also is, I think, an interesting story there. There's a number of roles of butyrate. One is, of course, in the rumen and developing the rumen epithelium, but if we're feeding it in the milk, probably not a lot of that is going to get into the rumen, but it also may have stimulatory effects on the gut in terms of how it's leading to development of the intestinal function, and actually some evidence that it may feed back actually to affect the rumen by blood-borne hormonal changes rather than being there directly. The other aspect might relate to antibacterial or bacteriostatic effect that butyrate to some degree, probably more so the other shorter medium chain fatty acids. So I think there's some potential of these different compounds to have an incremental effect in improving development and health in young calves.
Okay. I have one from, and I'm sorry in advance for mispronouncing your name, Sami El-Sadawi, and he says, we are using alfalfa in calves ration by 15%, and the starter is 18.5% crude protein, and weaning at 70 to 80 days of age, 120 kilograms. We arrive at first breeding at 12 months and feeding milk and milk replacer and starter ad libitum. What is your recommendations?
So I guess I'm unclear.
Okay, Dr. Drackely, what I'll do is I'll copy all this down into the questions so that you can see it easier.
Okay. So I guess wondering if he's talking about actually incorporating like ground alfalfa into the starter pellet, or if this is actual like chopped alfalfa in combination. But I think certainly the growth rates there are good. The overall fermentability of of the starter is going to be important. So not knowing exactly what the rest of it looks like is a little bit of a problem. But unless there's specific challenges that he's seen there, I'm not sure that I could make any recommendation for improvement. I think that providing it in the ration is again providing a combination, and as long as the calves are not sorting that out one way or the other, then it's probably working okay. That's a fair amount of additional fiber for the early life period when we're trying to get the rumen developed. Again, even the good quality hay is not going to be digested very well at all. So that would be my only comment, that perhaps the total inclusion is still a little bit high.
Okay. Maybe he will type in some more clarifications. I have one more question that I'm going to ask from the English language. I do know there are more questions in mine, but I know Paula has some. So I'll ask this following question, and then I will get back to the others. This is from Sylvia Baruki from BSc Animal Nutrition. Would you prefer 5% short hay in a calf starter or none at all if you had to make a decision? If yes, 5% on a dry matter basis?
I think that I would say under most circumstances, yes. I would certainly say that if it's a dry lot type of system where there's no straw bedding, then I think there's clear preference for the forage. If I could have 5% forage along with the starter, to me that's the best system, and under most circumstances, I think there would probably be some benefits observed.
Okay, thank you. So Sammy had clarification that the alfalfa is mixed with the starter.
Okay.
All right, and now I'm going to let Paula ask some questions, and I'll probably circle around back to Marcos before I go back to some more English language questions.
Yeah. And can I just add, I forgot the second part of his question was dry matter basis or as fed, and I think actually the hay and the starter are going to be essentially the same dry matter content, so I'm not sure it makes a difference whether it's as fed or dry matter.
Under bad temperature and humidity conditions, what would be the increment in nutrient requirements of maintenance for the calves?
Requirements are not defined as closely perhaps yet for calves as are the cold stress increments, but in general, if the calf is in a hot and humid environment above its thermoneutral zone, there's probably in the same range of about 25% increase in maintenance requirements. So it would be nice to be able to feed more to the calf to allow for that, but unfortunately one of the responses to heat stress is that calves don't want to eat as much, and particularly the dry feed consumption. So it's a situation where growth is going to be compromised relative to more comfortable conditions.
Okay, I'll ask a second question from Paula so that she can freely translate. What is your opinion regarding extruded high digestibility feed to enable weaning on day 30 without impacting average daily gain and improving post-weaning performance?
I haven't seen a lot of data on those. I'm aware of some of the development that's going on. Again, I think that's a strategy that if it can be shown to work in terms of dry feed utilization and consumption utilization of the feed, that's great. But I still, that's a separate issue to me, away from the idea of feeding more milk early to result in a better animal. So the combination of both of those approaches, I think, has merit, or certainly needs to be looked at, but I don't think that any system like that, extruded high digestibility feed, is going to be able to replace milk at a very early age. Excuse me.
So there is a couple of questions about processing of concentrates for calves, like pelleting, fine grinding. What would be comments on that?
In general, we would prefer the calf would prefer a coarser grind to a fine grind because of the dustiness and so on, or the lower palatability once it's a fine, very fine meal or a dusty mix. Along with some, I'm aware of some work where they looked at a finely ground concentrate mixture and then with some finely chopped hay mixed with that, and actually had some pretty good results. So I think there's some things that can be looked at to manipulate that. But as part of a complex starter mixture, I would say in general that a coarser grind is going to be preferable, more acceptable to the calf. Of course, we need a good quality pellet, some material that's going to hold the protein and the minerals and vitamins together and prevent it from being sorted out or lost in the fines of the.
Can I go to another one?
Yes, you can, Marcos.
Okay. There's one here on the biology of the milk yield response to intensive raising of dairy calves. What would be the mechanism? What would explain that? And if the response you could see in the second lactation also, or if the response is only in the first lactation?
Yeah. So I'll answer the second part of that first. The response is seen in continued improvements in later lactations as the data become available to follow more of those heifers into the second and third lactation. You don't lose that response. In fact, there's some additional response being observed. The mechanism is really not understood yet. Some people would argue that it's a benefit in terms of improved health early on, so that we're not perhaps having as many subacute respiratory infections or just a general improvement in health, but I really don't think that's the only answer. I think there's some kind of a programming effect happening. People are looking at a couple of different avenues. One is the recruitment of a population of stem cells that seem to be present early, maybe in the first month or so after birth. And then a second mechanism relates to possible changes in like epigenetic effects, where we're changing the expression of genes later in the program of development for milk production. And so those are both areas that are being actively looked at right now, but to my knowledge, nobody has really put forward a really clear hypothesis about what's happening other than those two general types of responses.
I knew that we would have a lot of questions for you, Dr. Drackely. First, I have a comment from Diana Allen, and she just wants us to thank you for a wonderfully clear and informative presentation. There's so much information that she's sure she will listen again, but it is now 1:15 in the UK, and she needs to go to bed so that she can get some work tomorrow. I know she just got back from holiday, so she might be very tired.
Well, thank you for the nice words.
And then we have from Donna Wirtz again. Can you explain testing of blood IG and should we do this immunoglobulin? And should we do this more regularly on the farm and perhaps group calves accordingly?
Yeah, interesting question. I think for troubleshooting situations, we would certainly recommend looking at IgG content, perhaps. More commonly, we're looking at blood total protein, and of course, being able to do that quite conveniently on farm with a refractometer, or just grabbing a sample and doing a quick total protein assay. So that usually is a good enough surrogate measurement for the IgGs themselves, and those are relatively simple to do on farm. No, I forgot the second part of the question.
Let me see. I can scroll back to that. Should we? Let's see. And perhaps group calves accordingly.
Yes, that was the interesting addition there.
Yes.
I think that's something that is very interesting in terms of managing, because we know, for example, that the calves probably will be growing differently if they have a bad start with low colostrum intake, and so perhaps the nutrition programs could be tailored better to those groups of calves. To my knowledge, nobody has really looked at that from a research standpoint, but it's an interesting idea. Perhaps some additional supplements that might be helpful for colostrum-deprived calves could be used in those situations, and not used for all calves. So it's a very interesting question.
Let's see. I have a question from Bill Top. I'm sorry. Acidified milk feeding programs were quite popular a while back, but I don't hear much about them now. What are your comments? And could we or should we be acidifying the free choice water supplied to calves?
Yeah, the acidified milk programs, it's actually the second time in my lifetime that I've seen them come around and disappear. So I think it was a relatively easy way, effective way to achieve larger milk intakes, and worked in group-fed calf situations. So that's the attraction. I think a couple of the reasons why they may have faded a bit again. One is just how you wean those calves. And so if you have calves of different ages within a group, it's very difficult to perform the weaning then of all the calves at the same time without limiting some. So the practices associated with weaning, it's a difficult system to work with that way. The other issue is just having to work with the acids on farm. The Canadian work in Ontario and so on was largely using formic acid, which we can't use in the U.S. It's kind of a nasty acid, as a lot of them are, and just concerns with handling that and so on. So I think probably the area from the calf standpoint that maybe is people were seeing slumping calves around weaning with those programs, and that maybe was discouraging a lot of the excitement. So as far as acidification of water, or acidification in general, the data that would show that acidification really can be effective in gut health and nutrient use and so on is pretty weak in my opinion, and I'm not sure if that's the angle that he was asking about, or whether it's some other angle on the water. But I would be hesitant about trying to acidify water because in general, one of the effects that the acidified milk programs used acid for was to limit the meal size. And so that would say to me that the acid water might also be a way to limit water intake, which is certainly not what we want to be doing. So unless I'm missing an angle of his question, I'm not. I don't see a.
Yeah, he may type in more to clarify. He did agree with your comments on the milk replacer or the acidified milk replacer. Mm-hmm. I have a question from Paula, and I'm assuming that it's just working better for Paula to have me ask them. How would you manage the fast growth program, liters of milk per week, and at what? And I think that's a week in age. And mm-hmm. At what age and days would you wean the calves?
I think the programs that have started off calves at a few days at 4 to 5 liters of milk, and then fairly quickly gone to maybe 6 liters a day for another week. By 2 to 3 weeks of age, having them up to 8 liters or so, or even higher in some circumstances. For some period of time, and then if they're able to step down that program over a couple of weeks, I think it's still still feasible to be weaning at 7 to 8 weeks if you have that system working where the calves are starting to pick up starter intake quickly. So
okay.
I don't think we have to be looking at really extensive feeding periods, but you know, that is always easier if you can extend the feeding period a bit.
Marcos, do you have questions?
Yeah, I have a couple here. Another one is about colostrum, about volumes, if there is anything new, or like we are proposing more milk for calves, and how is the story about colostrum feeding?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything tremendously new about the recommendations for colostrum intake, other than everything we're finding that's newer or specifically related to how to help calves use more milk would emphasize the importance of getting adequate colostrum in. So I think the recommendation to try to get 4 liters a day, or 4 liters into the calf at birth, followed by an additional couple of liters or as much as the calf will drink then later that in the first day, still are the most likely to lead to consistent success. I think the other aspect is that we always emphasize, or that I always emphasize, is quickly. And you know, if we could get farms to get colostrum in sooner, and I know it's difficult with larger 3 times a day operations in some case, but the sooner we can get the colostrum in, I think it lessens the importance of the quality aspect, and is just that much more effective in achieving adequate immune protection. A couple recent farm meetings that I did, there were a couple of farmers there that were getting colostrum into the calves on a fairly large farm within 1 hour regularly. At least that was his story. But so I think those benefits are equally as important as trying to push the large volumes of colostrum at once. So I think those are the issues. Just not limiting colostrum intake in the first provision, and then as much as they can get into the calf at the second feeding of the first day.
Someone is asking about use of corn silage for calves. Mm-hmm. When would you start, and if there is a big difference from hay or something like that?
Yeah. So the use of corn silage traditionally has been kind of discouraged in young calves up until maybe 6 months of age or something like that. But we see a lot of farms that are putting calves almost from after the first post-weaning group onto some sort of a TMR where corn silage would be a large component of that. I think the concerns about corn silage have been one, that the acid load that would come with the silage is counterproductive to what we're trying to do to the rumen in the young stage, so that there's too much additional acid coming in. We're trying to raise the pH of the young rumen, and that might be counterproductive. Some people would argue that though the moisture or perhaps the acidity or possible other fermentation products might limit intake. I don't know if that's really true or not. And then the other concern that I've always had is just the management of it, particularly for the young calves. That if we're not cleaning that out on a daily basis, we can get some nasty feed in there pretty quickly that calves are not going to want to consume, or that may contain molds and so on that we don't want them to consume. So I think with those things in mind, a lot of people have made it work in, say, the third to fourth month of life as part of a TMR. The work that I referenced from Spain, they had that corn silage was one of the options, and the calves seemed to eat about as much of that on a dry matter basis as they did with the other forages. So to me, it kind of comes down to a management aspect. A very limited amount if we're feeding it to young calves, and then management to keep it clean and fresh.
Water temperature is an issue on calf feeding. Like, can we manipulate anything by working on that?
Is that water, the temperature of the supplemental water, or is that used
the water the water that the calf is drinking?
Yeah.
Can we manipulate the rooming or have more fluids in the rooming fluid, or just by changing it?
I think, not sure that we can go to that extent, but certainly a warm water in a cold environment is beneficial to starter intake, seems to be beneficial, and it also lessens any additional cold load on the calf during living in a cold environment. Likewise, in the hot climates, cool water is probably the calves will probably do better on the cool water in terms of promoting dry feed intake and helping them to maintain body temperature and so on. I'm not sure that we can, at least I'm not aware of data that would show that we could manipulate other factors of rumen fluid composition or responses of the calf.
So coming back to Bill Topp's question about the acidified milk replacer, he said your answer was exactly what he wanted and anticipated regarding the water and the milk, acidified milk. And he said, thank you. It's a great presentation, and he enjoyed it thoroughly.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question from, and I'm going to kill this name, Zhangfei Zhang. What is your recommendation about avoiding weaning stress of calves?
Yeah, that's a very important issue that's certainly no one easy answer to that. I think the one aspect of that is trying to separate out the different stressors that the calves have to face. So my comments about not combining a lot of changes at one time, so that if their calves are housed in hutches, for example, that we don't move them out of the hutch the same day that we stop milk feeding. Give them some period of time in their new environment to adjust to the feeding changes before they have to deal with other social or environmental changes. That's the big factor management-wise. I think the gradual reduction of milk volume is another way to minimize some of the nutritional stress. Some people have had good success with continuing some warm water feeding for 3 days or so after they stop milk feeding or stop putting milk replacer powder into the water. So if somebody shows up with the same amount of warm water and the same feeding device at the same time of day, that kind of separates the weaning the nutritional component of weaning from some of the behavioral effects. So there's a variety of things like that. Again, trying to prevent the calf from losing a lot of intake, but also not facing a lot of behavioral stress at the same time.
Let's see. I have a question from Paula. What do you think about using TMR with heifer calves? And I'm not sure what age she's thinking of.
You said PMR or TMR?
TMR.
Partial mixed ration?
No, total mixed ration.
Total mixed ration. Okay. Yeah. So again, one simple system for a lot of farmers has been to for the next group out of the immediate transition group from weaning to introduce some fiber like we want to do, but to have that as a TMR. So it's worked very well on many farms to just use some of the lactating cow TMR. I think the key there is to minimize it, and so we're still ensuring enough of the starter or grower grain consumption. So typically it would be maybe 1 part of the TMR to 4 or 5 parts of the grower starter concentrate in order to ensure enough of the concentrate intake. But I think those systems can work very well. We just have to ensure that the total grain and protein intake is adequate for the calves, because they're still not going to be able to use large amounts of fiber very efficiently.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Sammy Isadawe. What about using chelated minerals and ionophore in calves in calf feeding.
Mm-hmm. Now, so the ionophores certainly have some benefit in terms of both growth promotion, but also in control of coccidiosis. The chelated minerals or organic sources, we've done a little bit of work with a couple of of organic or non-inorganic, I guess would be the best way to say that. And it appears that at the higher growth rates, perhaps the additional benefit of the non-inorganic forms of trace minerals can be beneficial. And did I forget part of that? Ionophores and chelated minerals.
Let me see. Chelated minerals and ionophores in calves feeding.
Okay.
So I don't think so.
I think I got it.
Very good. Let me see if Marcos has any more questions. Marcos, do you have any questions? Okay, good.
Yeah, I do. About the use of milk-derived protein, like whey protein concentrate for calves, if it would be an advantage?
Could you say that again? I'm sorry, missed part
the
of it.
The use of whey protein, milk-derived protein, in the concentrate for calves, not in the milk replacer.
Okay, so just using that as
a protein source.
As a protein source, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of larger calf ranches and so on that would be kind of making their own milk formula using whey powder or whey protein concentrate, and along with some a source of fat and other supplementation. So it's possible you lose some of the benefits of a complete milk replacer in terms of, well, certainly convenience, but in terms of the preparation that may improve total utilization of those ingredients, particularly if you're adding it with a fat source. But it's
another one is very general, is about the use of essential oils for calves. Mm-hmm. Like essential oils, a big group of additives, but any comment?
Yeah. So the essential oil compounds have been of a lot of interest for antimicrobial effects, perhaps, as well as maybe improving feed intake and utilization. There's some data available in calves. I would say that they're not overwhelmingly strong at this point, but I think the concept of natural occurring compounds being able to replace the need for antibiotics is still certainly an area of a lot of interest and importance. And there's suggestion from other species that maybe there is something to those compounds. So I think there's probably there may be a role for them. I think we still need to have a little bit better data in calves.
With very high quality silage, nutrient levels, energy, and crude protein are not enough to meet the requirement of young animals. Would the effect with ad libitum hay be similar or worse, or the same?
Even with high quality, probably about the same. The issue is none of the forages have the high enough energy and other nutrient available to the calf to support high rates of gain, and so that's why we have to be using more concentrate supplementation early in age. So I think that certainly the composition is different with corn silage or with hay, grass silage. But if you think about the kind of the upper limit of digestibility in the young calf, that none of them will have enough nutrition. So I think that's all part of the general problem.
Dr. Drackely, you've done a fantastic job fielding so many questions. I was super excited when we got a chance to have you talk. Paula has her question now. At what age do you suggest starting cattle on silage, corn, or alfalfa for rebreeding?
Not sure I understand that part of the question, but in general, we would say silages probably, and certainly not free choice silages until probably 6 or 8 months of age, but smaller amounts, as we've talked about, could go in probably as young as 3 to 4 months.
Okay, I think raising is rebreeding. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question from Bill Top. What will be the correlation between early calfhood nutrition and longevity of the cows that were raised that way?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think we can answer necessarily with data other than people that have been doing it in the field for many years. I think that raising an animal that is perhaps healthier early in life and more productive is going to enhance the chance for survivability. Obviously there's things that enter into leaving the productive herd that are somewhat independent of that plane of nutrition. But we did one of the studies we did a few years ago was looking at hoof development in the young calf, and we saw no abnormalities there, but we haven't published that yet, like too many things. But there's certainly no reason to believe that if we're growing young animals more rapidly that we're going to have a decrease in productive life, and I would predict that it should be favorable in the long term.
What is the best fat, what is the fat source of milk replacer and the suitable level of protein from plant source in milk replacers? And this is from Kuifeng Li.
Mm-hmm. So in the United States, most of the milk replacers would be using a good grade tallow, lard, and perhaps a bit of coconut oil, typically in a 40-40-20 or 45-10 ratio or something like that. So it's usually a blend of tallow and lard and some coconut oil. That will vary in different parts of the world, obviously, because wherever animal fats are prohibited by the BSE concerns, then it has to be some sort of a vegetable fat, which creates its own difficulties. The protein provision from plant proteins, the major plant protein sources that are available and have been thoroughly tested would be various soy protein preparations, wheat protein. Some areas of the world you'll see some other minor legume sources, but potato, for example. But for the most part, wheat and soy are the major things that we'll see. And the better preparations, calves do okay, but it's still quite difficult to find anything that will not cause some loss of performance in the first 2 to 3 weeks of life, particularly if we get certainly above 50% protein replacement from the vegetable protein sources. I think the effects are there's a few preliminary studies that have looked at replacing with more vegetable protein at high feeding rates, and I think that's an area that we really need to look at, because providing more nutrition to cover some of the perhaps the negative effects of the vegetable proteins may overcome some of those problems. The other factor is also trying to make sure that the key essential amino acids are balanced across those different sources.
Okay, I'm waiting on a question for Paula, but I have one. I'm curious about your information on some of the milk replacers that are sort of tailored either to specific times of the year or specific breeds even. Mm-hmm. Or some of the higher fat, higher protein milk replacers. Yeah. How do you feel about those?
Yeah, so there's several answers to that depending on which part of it. I think the products that are formulated for winter and summer are interesting because of probably some benefit of providing more fat in the winter even with the calves that are growing very rapidly, they could use some additional fat deposition as a way to help in those cold weather situations. The lower fat in summer is probably beneficial for helping to promote starter intake in those times. The breed things, certainly the Jersey formula, I think has been quite successful. It's difficult. A Jersey is not just a small Holstein, and so it's very challenging to keep them thriving, particularly in any kind of a cold weather situation. They really do seem to do better with the higher protein and higher fat formulation than the Holstein or other large breeds. The very high protein and high fat, would be more like a milk solids kind of a replacement. I think that's an area that, from a literature standpoint, it's not very well documented what might be possible with that. But yeah, there's certainly some interesting things going on in the field.
Thank you. I have a question from Paula. Until what age do heifers still have the esophageal groove reflex?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting that you can maintain that as long as you keep feeding liquid by the same technique as you do as a young calf. And actually, there have been people that have retrained functioning ruminants, older animals, to have that reflex by, again, bottle feeding water or something at that time period. So it's something that I think is maybe always there if the proper stimuli are provided. So calves lose it because they're not using it anymore, and the water is everything's going to go into the rumen. But you can maintain it, and in some cases, people have been able to reintroduce it.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Drackley. I was translating. It has been a very stressful webinar, but thank you. You did a great job. I liked it, and I hope our assistants enjoyed it as long as they could. But I think that they will enjoy it later.
Very good.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I will agree with Paula. I never quite get enough out of the webinars until I listen to them the second time. Marcos, thank you for the work you did for Marcelo. I understand you're going to continue on and discuss the whole webinar with the Brazilian audience.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. My first time as a moderator here. And thanks, Dr. Drackely, also for the sharing of knowledge and for all the information, and it was really great. Number of questions we had a lot of questions here, and I think people enjoyed it a lot. Thanks again.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. and I want to thank you, Dr. Drackely. It was great to listen to you, and thank you for everything you did. So I'm going to close out the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know we had some people that probably were up in the middle of the night or very, very early in the morning, and I'm always impressed that they try to make the live presentation. Sylvia says thank you very much. So thanks,
right.
Dr. Drackely. Have a good evening. Go home and have some dinner. You've earned it.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Yep.